June 11th, 1944. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea like a blade slicing through silk, sharp, cold, inevitable. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner stood on the bridge of the USS Rocky Mount, watching the horizon where sea met sky in a trembling line of pink and amber. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel. Beneath him, the steel deck vibrated with the thrumming heartbeat of engines, hundreds of them, synchronized across a fleet so vast it seemed to swallow the ocean itself. 535 ships stretched from horizon to horizon, their hulls cutting white furrows through water that had been still since the birth of the world. In the holds and on the decks, 127,571 men waited. Some prayed, some checked their rifles for the 100th time. Some simply stared at the islands rising like broken teeth from the sea ahead. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, the Marianas, islands whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce, whose beaches they'd never seen, whose soil they'd never touched. Islands that would become graveyards and airfields, in that order. Turner raised his binoculars. Through the salt-hazed lenses, he could see the dark, volcanic peaks of Saipan, 15 miles long and 7 miles wide, crowned with morning mist. Somewhere in those green mountains and sugar-cane fields, 32,000 Japanese soldiers were waking to their last ordinary sunrise. They did not yet know that Operation Forager had begun. They did not yet know that the empire was already dying, that the code had been cracked, that the war had turned. They believed still in divine wind and sacred homeland and bullets that could stop the tide. The fleet's guns spoke first. 700 naval guns opened fire simultaneously at 5:42 a.m. And the sound was not sound anymore, but something that bypassed the ears entirely and punched directly into the chest, the bones, the teeth. The horizon erupted in orange flowers of flame that bloomed and died and bloomed again. The bombardment would last for 3 days. It would consume 2,400 tons of shells. It would turn Saipan's coastal defenses into abstract sculptures of twisted metal and pulverized concrete. And it would not be enough. This was the nature of the Pacific War by the summer of 1944. Nothing was ever enough. Not enough ships, not enough planes, not enough bullets, not enough time. The Japanese defended every island as if it were the home islands themselves, fighting from caves and bunkers and spider holes with a ferocity that tactical manuals could not predict and firepower could not entirely suppress. They understood, perhaps before the Americans did, what the Marianas meant. Control of these islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, was not merely strategic, it was existential. The Marianas sat exactly 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, and to 5,000 miles was the operational range of a new American bomber that Japanese intelligence was only beginning to understand, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was not an aircraft. It was an apocalypse with wings. It could carry 8 tons of bombs, farther than any bomber in history, flying at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to breathe. It had pressurized cabins and remote-controlled gun turrets and enough fuel capacity to turn Japan's industrial heartland into a furnace. But first it needed bases. Concrete runways, 8,000 feet long, fuel depots, maintenance facilities, bomb storage areas. It needed islands, and the only islands close enough, big enough, flat enough were the Marianas. This was why Admiral Turner commanded the largest amphibious force ever assembled in the Pacific. This was why 127,571 men were sailing toward beaches they would have to take yard by bloody yard. This was why, at that very moment, 500 miles to the west, Admiral Mark Mitch's fast carrier task force was hunting the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Everything, the entire trajectory of the war, the fate of millions yet unborn, hinged on these islands. The Americans knew it. The Japanese knew it. And so the islands would burn. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded the defense of Saipan. He was a veteran of China, a professional soldier who had spent 30 years learning the science of fortification and the art of defensive warfare. He had transformed Saipan into a maze of bunkers and pillboxes, had positioned his artillery in caves where naval bombardment could not reach, had trained his men to absorb the initial American assault and then counterattack at night when American firepower meant less and Japanese spirit meant more. He had done everything correctly. He had followed doctrine, prepared his defenses, conserved his forces. And none of it mattered. On June 15, 1944, at 7 a.m., the first wave of American Marines hit the beaches. They came in LVTs, landing vehicle tracked, amphibious tractors that crawled out of the surf like prehistoric creatures, their treads chewing sand and coral. Machine gun fire raked them immediately. Artillery shells plunged from the hills. Mortar rounds fell in clusters that turned the beach into a garden of fire and shrapnel. Men died before their boots touched dry land. They died in the water, in the sand, in the shallow tidal pools that turned red and stayed red. By nightfall, 20,000 Marines had come ashore. 2,000 were casualties. But the beachhead held. It held because American artillery was already coming ashore. 105mm howitzers dragged through surf by engineers who worked under fire without pause. It held because American naval guns could drop shells with precision that Japanese spotters found supernatural, adjusting fire based on radio calls from observers who should have been dead. It held because American logistics could replace every lost rifle, every expended shell, every burned-out vehicle overnight. The Marines pushed inland through sugarcane fields that grew higher than a man's head, where Japanese soldiers waited in silence 3 feet away. They pushed through villages that had been vaporized by the preliminary bombardment. They pushed up hills that had names like Purple Heart Ridge and Death Valley, where the volcanic soil turned to red mud under the tracks of Sherman tanks. And slowly, meter by meter, they compressed the Japanese defenders into an ever-shrinking perimeter. But while the Marines bled on Saipan, the real decision was being made at sea. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet, 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, 11 heavy cruisers, and a belief that one decisive battle could still turn the war. He knew the Americans were invading the Marianas. He knew that if Saipan fell, Japan itself would be within bombing range. And he knew that the Japanese Navy's only remaining advantage was the range of its carrier aircraft, which could strike from distances where American planes could not respond. On June 19, 1944, Ozawa found Mitch's fast carrier task force and launched everything he had, 373 aircraft in 4 massive waves. They flew east toward the American carriers with orders to destroy the fleet, to sink the transports, to turn the invasion into a catastrophe that would buy Japan time, space, breathing room. It was a beautiful plan. It failed completely. American radar detected the Japanese planes while they were still 100 miles away. American fighters, F-6F Hellcats, designed specifically to kill Japanese aircraft, rose to meet them in numbers that Japanese pilots had never seen. And then the sky became an abattoir. The Hellcat pilots were not the green recruits of 1942. They were veterans with hundreds of combat hours, flying aircraft that were faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything in the Japanese inventory. They tore through the Japanese formations like wolves through sheep. Of the first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were destroyed. The second wave lost 98 of 130. The third wave, 70 out of 47. By sunset, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 243 carrier aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers, sunk by American submarines that had been trailing Ozawa's fleet like patient executioners. The Americans lost 29 aircraft. Pilots began calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the nickname stuck because it captured something essential. The war had become asymmetrical to the point of absurdity. Japanese courage, Japanese training, Japanese willingness to die, none of it mattered anymore against American production, American technology, American logistics. The industrial heartland of the United States was building aircraft faster than Japan could train pilots to fly them. And every day the gap widened. On Saipan, Lieutenant General Saito received word of the naval battle's outcome and understood immediately what it meant. No reinforcements would come, no supplies, no relief. His garrison would fight alone until ammunition ran out, and then they would die. Japanese doctrine was clear on this point. The Code of Bushido did not permit surrender. An officer who allowed his forces to be captured alive had dishonored not only himself, but his family, his ancestors, his emperor. Death was the only acceptable outcome. Saito drafted orders accordingly. As the American perimeter tightened around his last defensive positions in the north of the island, he prepared for what the Japanese called Gyokusai, a final suicidal charge that would kill as many enemies as possible before annihilation. It was a tactic born of desperation and culture, military pragmatism and religious fatalism. It was, in a sense, rational. If defeat was certain and surrender was impossible, then trading Japanese lives for American lives at the highest possible exchange rate was the last service a soldier could perform for his empire. On July 7, 1944, Saito issued his final order to the remaining defenders of Saipan, 4,000 soldiers, sailors and civilians armed with rifles, bayonets, swords, bamboo spears, and nothing. At dawn they attacked. They came out of the hills in a human wave, screaming, sprinting across open ground toward American positions that had been fortified overnight. American machine guns opened fire. Artillery shells fell in prearranged patterns. Mortars walked across the charging mass in steady increments. And still they came. They overran the first line of American positions through sheer momentum, killing men in their foxholes, bayoneting the wounded, dying in dozens and continuing forward. Some carried no weapons at all, simply running toward the American lines as if proximity alone could change the outcome. It took 12 hours to stop the attack. When the firing finally ceased, 3,000 Japanese bodies lay in the fields and gullies. American casualties exceeded 600, the highest single-day loss of the campaign. And for what? The island was still lost. The battle was still over. The charge had changed nothing except the speed with which the defenders died. But Lieutenant General Saito did not witness the outcome. He had committed suicide the night before, sitting in his command cave with his senior officers, sharing sake and poems before putting a bullet through his brain. It was a samurai's death, ritualized and controlled, chosen rather than imposed. And it was meaningless. The tactical futility of the Gyokusai attack exposed something that Japanese military culture could not confront. The empire had built a warrior tradition that knew only how to die gloriously, not how to survive intelligently. American forces, by contrast, had learned to be ruthlessly pragmatic. When a position was untenable, they withdrew. When casualties became unsustainable, they adapted tactics. They valued survival over honor, victory over gesture. And this, more than any technological advantage, was why they were winning. Saipan was declared secure on July 9, 1944. The cost, 426 American dead, 10,364 wounded. Japanese dead exceeded 29,000. Civilian casualties, Japanese settlers and native Chamorro Islanders, added another 22,000 to the toll, many of them suicides. Families leaping from cliffs rather than face American occupation because Japanese propaganda had convinced them that surrender meant torture, rape, and murder. The photographs of those cliffs, mothers clutching children, falling together into the sea, would haunt the Americans who witnessed them. War was supposed to harden men. This broke them instead. But sentiment was a luxury that strategic necessity could not afford. Even as the last Japanese holdouts were being killed or captured, American engineers were already surveying the central plain of Saipan for airfield construction. They worked with a speed that bordered on frenzy, laying out runway dimensions, calculating grading requirements, ordering equipment and materials from supply bases 3,000 miles away. The B-29s were waiting, The bombers existed, dozens already, hundreds in production, thousands planned. They existed in Kansas and Nebraska, in factories where women who had never touched an aircraft before were now riveting wings and installing engines with precision that would have impressed pre-war professionals. But existence was not enough. The B-29s needed to reach Japan, and Japan was too far from every existing American base. Until now, Tinian was next. The island lay just 3 miles south of Saipan, across a channel so narrow you could see one island from the other. It was flatter than Saipan, less mountainous, more suitable for airfield construction. It was defended by 9,000 Japanese troops who had watched Saipan burn and knew exactly what was coming. The invasion began on July 24, 1944. It lasted 9 days. 8,000 Japanese soldiers died, 390 Americans. The ratio was asymmetrical again, but the cost was still paid in flesh and pain, in young men who would never see Kansas or Nebraska again, who would be buried in cemeteries with views of the sea. And then the engineers arrived. Within weeks, they began constructing what would become the largest airbase in the world. They built not one runway but 6, each 8,000 feet long, each capable of launching a B-29 every minute. They poured 11 million square feet of concrete, graded 140 miles of roads, installed fuel tanks capable of holding 80 million gallons of aviation gasoline. They worked 24 hours a day under floodlights, transforming sugarcane fields into a monument to American industrial might. By November 1944, the first B-29s were landing on Tinian. By December, they were taking off for Japan. Guam was the last piece. The largest of the Mariana Islands, Guam had been an American possession since 1898, seized from Spain and turned into a modest naval station. The Japanese had captured it in December 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, and had spent 2.5 years fortifying it with the care of men who knew they were defending a prize worth keeping. 19,000 Japanese troops occupied Guam, dug into caves and bunkers, waiting. The invasion began on July 21, 1944. It ended on August 10th. 18,000 Japanese soldiers died. 7,000 Americans became casualties, 1,647 of them dead. And with Guam's capture, the Mariana Islands campaign concluded. In 60 days of fighting, the United States had seized 3 islands, destroyed the Japanese Navy's carrier capability, and established bases from which the B-29 Superfortress could reach every city in Japan. The cost was 5,000 American dead and 20,000 wounded. Japanese losses exceeded 55,000 military personnel and 22,000 civilians. The disparity was staggering, but numbers alone do not capture what the Marianas campaign meant to the men who fought it, to the strategists who planned it, to the empire that lost it. For the Japanese soldiers who defended Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the Marianas represented a fundamental collapse of the narrative they had been taught since childhood. They had been told that Japan was invincible, that the emperor was divine, that spirit could overcome material, that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. They had been told that the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was liberating Asia from Western colonialism, that the war was defensive, that Japan fought only to protect itself from encirclement and embargo. And then the American fleet arrived. It arrived with 535 ships, more vessels than the Japanese Navy had possessed at the height of its power. It arrived with aircraft so numerous they darkened the sky, with ammunition expended so freely that Japanese officers could not comprehend the logistics required to supply it. It arrived with a casual, terrifying abundance that made mockery of Japanese scarcity. The Japanese defenders had been issued 50 rounds of ammunition per rifle, with orders to make every shot count. American Marines landed with 200 rounds per man, with more in resupply just offshore, with so much ammunition that they could fire suppressing bursts at suspected positions just to avoid risk. The Japanese had been rationing food since 1943, cutting rations until soldiers grew thin and weak. American supply ships arrived with rations so plentiful that excess food was sometimes buried to prevent spoilage. The Japanese fought from caves because they lacked the concrete and steel to build proper fortifications. Americans built instant harbors, piers, roads, entire towns on captured islands within weeks. The contrast was ideological. It was material. It was spiritual. And it could not be reconciled with the worldview that Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated to accept. Some understood before they died. There are letters found on Saipan, written by Japanese soldiers in the final days before the American assault. Letters never mailed, but preserved by accident in abandoned packs and bunkers. They speak of realization. One lieutenant wrote to his wife, "We have been told that Americans are weak, that they love comfort too much to fight well. But I have seen their ships. I have counted them. If this is weakness, then we have no word for strength." Another, a sergeant from Hokkaido, wrote in his diary, "The bombardment never stops. For 3 days it has continued without pause. How much ammunition do they have? How many shells? We fire 10 rounds and must conserve. They fire 10,000 and do not even notice. I begin to think we were lied to about many things." These were not defeatist sentiments in the ordinary sense. They were observations from men who had confronted an ontological shock. The Empire had told them they were fighting a decadent, declining West, and instead they faced an industrial colossus that seemed to operate on principles of abundance that bordered on the supernatural. And the realization came too late to change their fates. By the time Japanese soldiers on Saipan understood the true scale of American production, they were already surrounded, already outnumbered, already dying. The understanding did not save them. It only made the dying more bitter. For the Americans, the Marianas campaign was a vindication of strategic planning that had begun years earlier, in the dark days after Pearl Harbor, when victory seemed distant and uncertain. In early 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had commissioned Boeing to design a bomber that could strike Japan from distant bases if the Pacific War went badly and forward bases were lost. The result was the B-29, an aircraft so advanced it required technological breakthroughs in engines, pressurization, and aerodynamics. It was enormously expensive. Each B-29 cost $639,000, more than twice the cost of a B-17. The entire program, including research and development, consumed over $3 billion, making it the second most expensive weapons program of World War II after the Manhattan Project. And for years, it had no bases within range of Japan. The Marianas changed that. By February 1945, hundreds of B-29s were operating from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. They flew missions in formations of 300 bombers or more, dropping incendiary bombs that turned Japanese cities into firestorms. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, one by one, the industrial centers that supplied Japan's war machine, were incinerated. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 people, more than either of the atomic bombs that would follow in August. It was the deadliest air raid in human history, and it was launched from Tinian, from runways built on the graves of men who had died taking the island 9 months earlier. There is a photograph taken on Tinian in July 1945. It shows a B-29 named Enola Gay being loaded with a single bomb, 10 feet long, shaped like an oversized torpedo, painted dull green. The bomb had a nickname, Little Boy. It weighed 9,700 pounds and contained 64 kilograms of uranium-235. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay took off from Tinian's North Field, flew 6 hours to Japan, and dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima. The explosion killed 70,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from radiation sickness in the weeks that followed. 3 days later, another B-29 boxcar took off from Tinian carrying a plutonium bomb called Fat Man. It destroyed Nagasaki. 6 days after that, Japan surrendered. The Second World War ended on the decks of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, with Japanese officials signing instruments of surrender, while American bombers, B-29s from the Marianas, flew overhead in formation. The irony was almost too perfect. An empire brought low by aircraft launched from islands it had been unable to defend. Islands that had seemed insignificant until suddenly they were the most important strategic real estate in the Pacific. But the fall of the Marianas meant more than runways and bomb tonnage. It meant the psychological collapse of a military regime that had ruled through mysticism and propaganda. On July 18, 1944, 9 days after Saipan was declared secure, General Hideki Tojo resigned as Prime Minister of Japan. Tojo had been the architect of Japan's war strategy, the man who had ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had promised the emperor that victory would come swiftly, that the United States lacked the will to fight a prolonged war. Saipan proved him catastrophically wrong, and his resignation was an admission, implicit but undeniable, that the war was lost. Not that it would be lost, that it already was lost, that the only remaining question was how many more would die before Japan accepted the inevitable. The Imperial Japanese government did not admit this publicly, of course. Propaganda ministries continued to broadcast messages of inevitable victory, of Americans being driven back, of divine wind that would rise to protect the homeland. But the educated elite knew, military officers knew, even the emperor, insulated as he was in the imperial palace, knew. Saipan had been called the barrier of the Pacific. Its fall meant there were no more barriers. Japan lay exposed, vulnerable, waiting for the fire from above. And so the Japanese government made a decision that was pragmatic, ruthless, and ultimately futile. They would sacrifice the outer islands to buy time. They would let the Americans take the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would let them spend American lives and American time while Japan prepared for the final battle on the home islands themselves. It was a strategy that prolonged the war by a year and killed hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. And it changed nothing. The outcome was determined the moment the Marines landed on Saipan. Everything after was epilogue. The B-29s that flew from Tinian carried more than bombs. They carried a message, tangible and terrible, that distance was no defense, that oceans could not protect, that a nation which lacked the industrial base to produce thousands of heavy bombers had no future in a modern total war. The Japanese had built an empire on the backs of Asian labor and resources, but they had never developed the industrial infrastructure to sustain prolonged mechanized warfare. They could build excellent fighters and destroyers with skilled craftsmen working in small batches. They could not build them in the quantities that American mass production achieved. By 1945, the United States was producing one aircraft every 5 minutes. Japan's entire annual production could not match America's monthly output. And this disparity, industrial, material, fundamentally economic, was what doomed Japan from the moment the war began. The battles were just the mechanism by which an inevitable conclusion was reached. The Marianas Campaign clarified this. It transformed abstract industrial statistics into concrete strategic reality. Runways, fuel depots, bombers, burned cities. The engineers who built Tinian's airfields worked with a precision and speed that Japanese observers, had any survived to witness it, would have found incomprehensible. American construction battalions, the famous Seabees, could grade land, pour concrete, install lighting, and have a functional runway operational in weeks. They worked with machinery that was itself a kind of abundance: bulldozers, graders, cement mixers, cranes, trucks, all mass-produced, all expendable, all replaceable if damaged or destroyed. This was the secret that Japanese military planners had failed to understand. American abundance was not a weakness. It was a weapon The ability to waste resources, to use overwhelming material superiority, to reduce risk to American lives, to expend 1,000 shells to kill one enemy sniper. This was not decadence. It was doctrine, and it worked. There's a recording made on Saipan in early July 1944, an audio fragment captured by a Signal Corps technician testing new recording equipment. It preserves a conversation between two Marines resting behind a Sherman tank, waiting for orders to advance. One of them, his voice young, Midwestern, says, "You ever think about what happens after? After we win?" The other Marine, older, says, "Winning ain't the hard part. It's making it stick." The first Marine says, "What do you mean?" The older Marine says, "I mean, we can take any island. We got the ships, the planes, the bullets. But holding it? Keeping it? Making it worth what we paid? That's different." There's a long pause. Artillery rumbles in the background. Then the younger Marine says, "I guess we build something. Airfields and such." The older Marine says, "Yeah, airfields. And then what? We leave? Let someone else take it back?" Another pause. Then, "I don't know. I just don't want to do this again." The recording ends there. The conversation is mundane, almost banal, but it captures something essential. The Americans fighting in the Marianas understood, however dimly, that they were not just taking islands. They were building infrastructure for a war of annihilation, for bombers that would burn cities, for a strategic logic that reduced human beings to targets and cities to map coordinates. They understood that Saipan was not an end but a means, that the killing would not stop until Japan could not fight anymore, until the empire was not merely defeated but dismantled. And some of them were troubled by this understanding. Not enough to stop, not enough to question orders, but enough to ask what came after. Enough to wonder if victory would feel like victory or just like exhaustion. The Japanese soldiers and civilians on Saipan asked different questions in their final hours. They asked why the fleet had not come, why the promised reinforcements never arrived, why the empire that had claimed divine protection was allowing them to be slaughtered on a forgotten island. Some of the letters and diaries recovered after the battle express rage, not at the Americans, but at their own commanders, at the high command in Tokyo that had sent them to Saipan with inadequate supplies and false promises. One captain wrote in his final diary entry, "We were told Saipan was unsinkable. We were told the Americans could never take it. We were told many things, all lies. We die for lies." This was heresy in the context of Japanese military culture, where loyalty to superiors was absolute and criticism was tantamount to treason. But in the final days, when death was certain and the pretense had collapsed, some men found the courage to name the betrayal. They had been sacrificed not for strategic necessity, but for political theater, to maintain the fiction that the empire was still strong, still capable of defense, still blessed by the gods. The truth, that Japan had lost the war years earlier and was now simply dying in installments, was too bitter to be spoken aloud. But it was there, in the silence between the artillery barrages, in the eyes of men who stopped cleaning their rifles because there was no more ammunition, in the way officers distributed the last grenades, with instructions that one was to be kept for suicide. The realization that the empire had already failed, that they were dying not for victory, but for delay, that their deaths would buy nothing except a few more weeks of denial. This was the true defeat. The loss of the islands was tactical. The loss of faith was existential. And yet the Americans who landed on those beaches, who climbed those hills, who poured concrete and strung barbed wire and buried their friends, did they truly understand what they were building? Did they grasp that Tinian's runways would enable the atomic bombs, that the Marianas campaign was not just another step toward victory, but the platform for annihilation? Most did not. Most understood only the immediate. Take the hill, clear the bunker, hold the line until dawn. The strategic vision, the B-29s, the firebombing, Hiroshima, that was the domain of planners in Washington, of generals and admirals who moved pins on maps and calculated acceptable losses. The men who fought understood something simpler. that they had been asked to take 3 islands, that taking them cost thousands of lives, that the cost was paid. Whether the cost was worth it depended on what came after. And what came after was fire. By the spring of 1945, American B-29s were flying from the Marianas almost daily, dropping incendiaries on Japanese cities that had been built for centuries from wood and paper. The fires created windstorms, tornadoes of flame that sucked oxygen from the air and asphyxiated those who survived the initial burning. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. Hundreds of thousands died. And the bombers kept coming, wave after wave, because the Marianas provided the bases, and American industry provided the bombers, and the logic of total war provided the justification. Was it necessary? Strategically, probably. Japan's military had shown no inclination to surrender, even as defeat became obvious. The planned invasion of the home islands, Operation Downfall, would have cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese deaths. The firebombing and the atomic bombs ended the war without that invasion. They saved lives according to the arithmetic of total war. But arithmetic does not account for the moral weight, for the children who burned, for the cities that were erased, for the precedent that was set. The Marianas Campaign made that possible. The islands were the platform. The bombers were the instrument, the cities were the target, and the justification was written in the blood spilled taking Saipan. 50 years later, veterans of the Marianas Campaign would return to the islands for anniversaries and memorials. They would walk beaches that had been rebuilt, visit cliffs where Japanese civilians had leaped to their deaths, stand on runways that had launched the Enola Gay, and they would struggle to articulate what it meant, what they felt. Some would say it was necessary. Some would say it was worth it. Some would say nothing at all because the weight of memory was too great for words. There is a memorial on Saipan, a marble wall inscribed with the names of American dead. It stands on a hill overlooking the invasion beaches, with a view of the sea where the fleet had gathered. On clear days, you can see Tinian across the channel. The memorial's inscription reads, "These men gave their lives that others might live in freedom." It is a standard epitaph, noble and uncontroversial. But standing there, watching the waves break on the reef where LVTs had crawled ashore under fire, it is impossible not to ask, did they know? Did the Marines who died on that beach understand that they were dying so that bombers could incinerate cities? Did they consent to that transaction? Or did they die believing something simpler, that they fought to protect home, to defend their buddies, to end the war and go back to Kansas or Nebraska or wherever home was? The answer, perhaps, is that they died for both. That wars contain layers of meaning, that soldiers fight for immediate reasons while their deaths serve distant purposes, that the same action can be both noble sacrifice and instrumental violence. The Marines who took Saipan were brave. Their mission enabled atrocities. Both things are true. History does not resolve contradictions. It only accumulates them. The Japanese who died defending the Marianas left fewer memorials. Most were buried in mass graves or consumed by fire. Their names were recorded in ledgers that tracked casualties with bureaucratic precision: unit, rank, date of death, cause if known. But their individual stories, what they believed, what they feared, what they understood in their final moments, these were lost, except in fragments, except in the letters found in abandoned packs, the diaries recovered from caves, the few prisoners who survived despite orders to die rather than surrender. One such prisoner, a lieutenant captured on Tinian after being wounded, was interrogated by American intelligence officers. The interrogation transcript survives in the National Archives. The lieutenant, his name redacted in the document, was asked why Japanese soldiers fought to the death, even when defeat was obvious. His answer translated, "Because surrender is not death. Surrender is extinction. A soldier who dies in battle is remembered. His family receives honor. His name is spoken at shrines. But a soldier who surrenders ceases to exist. His family is shamed. His ancestors are dishonored. He becomes nothing. We are not brave. We are terrified of the alternative. This was the mechanism of Japanese military culture. It did not inspire men to heroism so much as terrorize them into compliance. The choice was not between life and death, but between an honorable death and a dishonorable survival that was worse than death. And so they charged into machine gun fire, detonated grenades in bunkers, swam into the sea with stones in their pockets. Not because they wanted to die, but because the alternative had been made unthinkable. This was the Empire's final cruelty to its own soldiers. It gave them no way to live. The American Marines who witnessed the Gyokusai charges, who shot men running at them with bayonets fixed and mouths open in screams, often reported feeling not triumph, but horror. They were killing men who seemed to want to be killed, who threw themselves at American guns with a desperation that bordered on the suicidal. Which of course it was. One Marine corporal, interviewed decades later, said, "We were told they were fanatics." And they were, I guess. But after Saipan, I started thinking maybe they were just scared. Not of us, of what would happen if they didn't die. And that's worse somehow. At least if they were fanatics, it meant something to them. But if they were just scared, if they were just boys like us who got told they had to die or their families would suffer, that's just evil. He was not wrong. The Japanese military's insistence on death before surrender was a form of systemic violence against its own soldiers, a doctrine that guaranteed maximum casualties for minimum strategic gain. And the Americans, despite their material advantages and tactical superiority, could not prevent it. They could only kill the men who charged at them and move on. The moral burden of that killing, of shooting men who seemed to be committing suicide by enemy fire, was rarely discussed in official accounts. But it appears in letters, in diaries, in the nightmares that veterans carried home and never entirely shed. By August 1945, the Marianas had become something like a small American city, transplanted to the middle of the Pacific. Tinian alone housed 40,000 American personnel, pilots, mechanics, bomb loaders, cooks, medics, clerks. There were movie theaters and baseball fields, mess halls that served hot meals 3 times a day, hospitals with the latest medical equipment. There were runways where B-29s landed and took off every few minutes, a rhythm that never stopped, a mechanical heartbeat that pulsed day and night. And there were the bombs. Thousands of them, stacked in storage areas, loaded onto carts, wheeled to waiting bombers. They had stenciled names, cities in Japan, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama. The names were written in chalk on the bombs' casings, a kind of manifest destiny rendered in explosive ordnance. The men who loaded the bombs knew where they were going. They knew abstractly that each bomb would kill people. But abstraction is how modern war functions. The distance between loading a bomb on Tinian and that bomb detonating over a residential neighborhood in Osaka is not just spatial, but psychological. The men who did the loading did not see the fires, did not hear the screams, did not smell the burning flesh. They saw tonnage and targets, numbers on a briefing sheet, another mission completed. This was the innovation of industrial warfare. It allowed mass killing to be conducted by ordinary men who were not cruel, who were not sadistic, who were just doing their jobs. The cruelty was built into the system, distributed across so many participants that no single person had to bear the full moral weight. The bombardier who released the bombs over Tokyo did not decide to burn the city. He followed orders. The officer who gave the order did not choose the target. He executed a strategy. The strategist who designed the firebombing campaign did not light the fires. He calculated probabilities, and so the responsibility dissolved into a fog where everyone was complicit and no one was guilty, except that cities still burned, except that people still died, except that cause and effect still connected the runways on Tinian to the ashes in Japan. The atomic bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, were the logical conclusion of this process. They were loaded onto B-29s at Tinian, just like thousands of conventional bombs before them. The crews that flew the missions did not know, initially, what they were carrying. They were told the bombs were special, that the missions were secret, that they would understand after. And then Hiroshima vanished in a flash of light and a mushroom cloud that rose 40,000 feet into the sky, and the world entered a new era. The Marianas campaign had made that era possible. The islands were the platform from which atomic warfare was launched. And this fact, that Operation Forager, which began as an amphibious assault to capture strategic airfields, ended as the enabling condition for nuclear weapons, gives the campaign a significance that transcends its tactical details. It was the hinge on which the Pacific War turned, the moment when American industrial superiority was translated into strategic dominance, when the distance between America and Japan ceased to be a defense and became a death sentence. The Japanese had gambled that America lacked the will to project power across the Pacific. The Marianas proved them catastrophically wrong, and in proving them wrong, the campaign revealed a truth about modern war: that will matters less than capacity, that courage cannot defeat logistics, that an empire built on mysticism and ritual cannot withstand an opponent built on factories and oil fields and the grim arithmetic of mass production. This was the lesson written in the sand of Saipan, in the blood spilled on Tinian, in the ashes of Hiroshima. It was not a lesson anyone wanted to learn. But history is not concerned with preference. It is concerned only with what happened. And what happened was that 3 islands fell and an empire followed. Years later, researchers would discover that American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications throughout the Marianas campaign, that they had read Admiral Ozawa's battle plans before the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, that they had known the locations of Japanese defenses on Saipan with precision that should have been impossible. The war had been fought with an advantage that the Japanese never suspected, that their codes had been broken years earlier, that their most secret orders were being read in Washington before Japanese commanders in the field received them. This knowledge that the outcome was never in doubt, that the tactical victories were foregone conclusions, that the Japanese were fighting a war they had already lost without knowing it, makes the casualties seem even more senseless. Men died by the thousands for islands that were going to fall regardless, charging machine guns in banzai attacks that American intelligence had predicted days in advance. If the Japanese had known their codes were broken, would they have fought differently? Would they have surrendered Saipan rather than defend it to annihilation? Probably not. Japanese military culture did not permit strategic withdrawal. Surrender was unthinkable, even when continuation was hopeless. And so the war continued, battle after battle, island after island, each one a smaller version of the Marianas. Americans landing with overwhelming force, Japanese defending with suicidal determination. The outcome predetermined, but the dying required nonetheless. Until finally, in August 1945, the dying stopped. Not because anyone wanted it to stop, but because there was nothing left to fight with. The empire had been burned from the sky, its cities reduced to rubble, its people starving, its military shattered. And the bombers that did the burning had flown from Tinian, from runways built on an island that most Americans could not find on a map. There is a photograph taken on Tinian in September 1945, after the war ended. It shows a B-29 being dismantled, its wings removed, its fuselage cut into sections for scrap metal. Around it, the airfield is already returning to jungle. Weeds grow through cracks in the concrete. The gun emplacements are rusting. The barracks are empty. The war is over, and the infrastructure that enabled the final victory is already being abandoned, already decaying back into the landscape. The photograph is mundane, undramatic, but it captures something true, that the physical apparatus of war, the bases, the runways, the weapons, are temporary. They are built for a purpose, and when the purpose is fulfilled, they are left to rot. What persists is the memory, the knowledge, the precedent. The knowledge that distance is no defense, that oceans can be crossed, that cities can be burned from the sky, that total war once begun follows its own logic to conclusions that no one intended but everyone enabled. The Marianas Campaign was not the cause of that logic, but it was the mechanism. It was the place where strategic abstraction became physical reality, where plans drawn on maps in Washington were translated into runways and bombs and burned cities. And for the men who fought there, American and Japanese alike, it was a place where ideology met material reality and shattered. The Japanese discovered that spirit could not stop steel. The Americans discovered that abundance did not make killing easy. Both sides learned that modern war is industrial, impersonal, and utterly pitiless. These lessons were written in the volcanic soil of Saipan, in the sugarcane fields of Tinian, in the jungles of Guam. They were paid for with 5,000 American lives and 55,000 Japanese lives. And they made possible a weapon that would kill hundreds of thousands more. Was it worth it? The question assumes a counterfactual. What would have happened if the Marianas had not fallen, if the B-29s had no bases, if the atomic bombs could not be delivered? Would the war have lasted longer? Would more have died in a prolonged invasion of Japan? The arithmetic suggests yes. The moral calculus is less clear. But history does not traffic in counterfactuals. It traffics in what happened. And what happened was that 3 islands were taken, that runways were built, that bombers took flight, that cities burned, that the war ended. Cause and effect, linked in a chain that began on a beach in Saipan and ended in the ruins of Hiroshima. This is the story of Operation Forager. Not a story of heroism or villainy, though both were present. Not a story of good versus evil, though both sides believed they were righteous. A story of capacity, industrial, military, destructive. A story of what happens when total war meets total production, when the question is not whether to fight, but only how much force can be brought to bear. The answer, written across the Pacific in steel and fire, was all of it. Every ship, every plane, every bomb. Everything the United States could build, it built. Everything it could deploy, it deployed. Everything it could destroy, it destroyed. And Japan, with a fraction of the industrial capacity, with a military culture that valued death over adaptation, with an empire built on conquest but incapable of sustaining modern mechanized war, could not respond in kind, could only die slowly and expensively until there was nothing left to die for. The Marianas Campaign was the proof of concept for that destruction. And the runways on Tinian were the platform from which it was delivered, simple concrete and steel, poured and graded by men who thought they were just building airfields, men who did not know they were constructing the machinery of apocalypse. But that is how history works. The large consequences emerge from small actions, from tactical decisions that seem reasonable at the time, from engineers laying concrete and Marines taking hills and bombardiers releasing bombs. Each action is comprehensible in isolation. Together, they constitute something vast and terrible, something that no single person intended, but everyone participated in creating. This is the inheritance of the Marianas Campaign, not just the tactical victory, not just the strategic outcome, but the knowledge that modern war is a machine that, once set in motion, grinds everything in its path. Ideology, courage, innocence, cities, lives, all of it fuel for the machine. And the machine runs until there is nothing left to burn. Then it stops, and the survivors, those who loaded the bombs, those who flew the missions, those who survived the fires, are left to ask what it meant. To ask if it was necessary, if it was just, if it was worth the cost. To ask and to live with the answers, or the absence of answers, because some questions cannot be answered, only endured. And that endurance, that living with the weight of what was done and what it enabled, is perhaps the truest cost of all. Not counted in dollars or casualties, but in the quiet moments when veterans wake at 3 in the morning and remember the beach, the fire, the smell of burning. When they remember the names on the bombs, the cities that burned, the logic that said it was necessary. When they remember and cannot forget and must carry that memory forward because history demands it. Because if the cost is forgotten, then it becomes easy to pay again. And the lesson of the Marianas, the lesson written in blood and fire across 3 small islands in the middle of the Pacific, is that the cost is always higher than anticipated, always more terrible than planned, always paid by people who did not choose the war, but died in it nonetheless. This lesson is not unique to the Marianas. It is the lesson of every war, repeated endlessly, learned and forgotten, and learned again. But in the Marianas, it took a particular form, the form of runways that launched the apocalypse, of islands seized at terrible cost to enable destruction on an even more terrible scale. The form of young men who took a beach and built an airfield and never knew, could not have known, that they were constructing the end of the world, or at least the end of a world. The end of an era when oceans were barriers and distance was defense, and cities could burn but not vanish in an instant. That world ended on Tinian, in the belly of a B-29, in the shape of a bomb that weighed 10,000 pounds and contained the fire of the sun. And it began on Saipan, on a beach at dawn, when the first Marine stepped from his landing craft into the surf and started walking toward the sound of guns. Everything after was consequence, and the Marianas were the pivot on which that consequence turned.